Well, hello there, my dear friends. I am so excited to be back with all of you tonight. A heart filled with gratitude, of course, because your response was overwhelming to our very first episode regarding Edrick Faust's conviction for Tara Baker's murder. Tara, of course, being the subject of this podcast for the last 6 years. I've said it before, I'll say it again. We could not and we would not be here if it were not for this community, for law enforcement, for listeners just like you. So I again say thank you. But I have to go a step further in that gratitude and let you know that Tara's family wants to send their gratitude too. And they really want us all to remember to keep centering her in this story. You know, for 6 years, we talked about Tara's life and her legacy. We talked about her as a classmate, fully devoted to her studies. We talked about her as a girlfriend, fully in love with her boyfriend, Chris Melton. We talked about her as a daughter, a sister, a friend, and most importantly, someone who would seek out the lost, the left behind, and the least of these. This is the victim we are talking about, not some online character that has been portrayed. And you know, as I've been reflecting over the last few days, and you all, I had to take a second and breathe just like all of you. But at the end of my interview with David Griffith, it really became this simple to me. When you strip away the speculation, when you get away from the lies and rumors, and when you get the downright slander that's occurring out the window, the evidence in this case was simple. And who better to ask than members of the jury in this case? At the conclusion of this trial, I attempted to send a handwritten letter to jurors to learn about their experience and to dispel what I found to be some of the most ridiculous online chatters that were happening. It was very concerning as safety was being threatened. And you see, over the last several days, I have had the honor and privilege to speak with 2 men who served on the jury in the Tara Baker murder trial. I've also received a formal statement from a woman who served on that same jury. So, tonight I want us to do what we had to do last week too. Get away from all that noise just for a little bit. Step away from the rumors and the secondhand theories and the people online who are speaking with a hell of a lot of confidence about a room they were never in. Tonight is about what I learned from the jurors who were actually there. Was there really shouting matches? Did jurors feel outside pressure? And did someone just give in to go home? Well, tonight is about continuing to speak the truth for Tara, because she and her family deserve nothing less. Welcome, welcome, welcome back, my friends. I'm honored to be in this with you. I'm Cameron J. All right, again, welcome, welcome, welcome back. It feels good to be saying that more often these days, and how remarkable that it is in the aftermath of Tara's case being solved. We never thought, of course, 6 years ago we'd be here. I say it all the time, but we did this, all of us, together. But since the verdict in this case, there has been no shortage of online commentary. We talked about a lot of it last week. It comes with the territory. There's been some, conversations online that I have found to be really thoughtful, but a lot of it has not. And what really has bothered me is hearing people confidently speak for the jury, assigning motives to the jury and repeating claims about that deliberation room as though they had been sitting in it. Folks, I want to make one thing very clear. The people that are speaking loud about apparent happenings in the jury room were not there. But before we go any further, I want to ground us in something that is really important here because I think this matters. This jury was made up of 9 white neighbors, 2 black neighbors, and 1 Latino neighbor. It included 4 women and 8 men. Ages ranged from people in their 20s to beyond their 60s, and the alternatives reflected a range too, 2 black women and 1 white man. So why does this matter? Well, online, people have tried to flatten this jury into one motive, one story, one caricature, one monolith. And the fact is that is never the case. This was a cross-section of our community asked to carry one of the heaviest responsibilities our system can place on ordinary people. I've never been called for jury duty, probably never will be. I hear people that get called very often. So good luck to all of you when you get that jury summons. But what I want to add here is that the jury is truly of one's peers. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that the jury, for me, would be 12 white people and that's the jury of my peers, 12 white men. No, what it means is 12 ordinary people, citizens, residents of your local community, your peers, the people you live with, work around, and raise your families amongst. So now that we have that out of the way, and now that I've had these direct conversations with jurors, the third juror gave us a formal statement that we'll be reading directly to you. So tonight I'm going to do some things a little differently here. No interview, it's just me, but I'm going to share what I learned and what it confirmed for me with the hopes that it'll be able to help some of you all too, struggling with all the nonsense and the noise. But I would not be a good host if I didn't remind you real quick to like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, and make sure you follow us on Instagram as well. And of course, you can always support this work in the comments at the link where 20% of donations are forwarded to our friends at St. Inc. supporting sexual assault victims right here in our community. So let's get into it. What did the jury have to say? So let's get into it. And I think a good place for me to start is why I decided to reach out to the jury in the first place. I did not go looking for jurors because I simply wanted content. That really was never the point for me. I never thought I would send them a correspondence. I wanted them to go back to their private lives, which is what most people do at the conclusion of jury trial. But what pushed me to reach out to these individuals was watching the public conversation get more reckless by the day. People were claiming jurors were bullied. People were claiming somebody got tired, threw their hands up, and just voted guilty just to go home. People were claiming to know what happened in the deliberation room when, in reality, they were nowhere near it. So when jurors were willing to speak with me, I listened, and I'm grateful that they've allowed me to share with you what I learned from those conversations. What I heard was thoughtful, it was measured, and it was human. It did not sound anything like the fantasy version of jury deliberations that people might dream up by watching, television online that is trying to sell, right? It's nothing like that. Tonight I want to break this into 3 parts, and I hope you can stay with me. First, we're going to learn about what I learned from Juror A, a man that I spoke with. Then, we'll learn from Juror B, another man that I spoke with. And finally, I want to end the section of this juror review with a statement from Juror C, a woman on the jury whose words I think deserve to be heard too. And along the way, I also want to address a few new rumors that have been floating around since our last episode. My goodness, could we not get any more? So instead of lending credibility to online commentators, let's just recap my conversations with the people who actually served. And that starts with Juror A. So, this juror and I have a really interesting connection story. Something you might not know about me in the podcast is that when I typically do outreach to a family or a loved one or, an attorney I want to speak on the podcast, rarely ever do I send an email. Even more rarely do I call them. I typically will handwrite or type, when my handwriting's having a bad day, a letter and send it to them in the mail. The reason that I've taken this approach is I know you hate a cold call. I hate a cold call. We all hate a cold call about things that are especially private like this, right? So never my approach. Always send them a letter and let them decide what to do. So what's funny is, as I got to talking with Juror A, he starts telling me that he never checks his mailbox. Never. But it just so happened that one day last week, he came home and his mailbox was hit by a deer. Yes, and one of the first things that he looked down and saw was my letter. And that led him to call me. He had discovered the podcast already post-trial, but was really excited to share his experience. And, one of the first things that stood out to me in my conversation with who I'm calling Juror A was just how plainly he said it, y'all. For him, it came down to the DNA. That was the center of the case. And he went on to say that it wasn't just the DNA itself, but that his DNA alongside Edrick Faust denying that he knew Tara Baker at all really sealed the deal for him. And I think that's really important because one of the things I keep seeing online is this idea that the jury reached this verdict based on emotion or pressure or some kind of outside influence instead of the actual evidence. But that's not what I learned, and that is not what Juror A described to me. Instead, he described someone that was actually looking for an explanation from the defense that never came. He described hearing the defense try to create doubt, but in his view, never really dealing with the DNA in any meaningful way. Direct quote there. And I do want to stop here because I think that matters. See, we can all dislike the verdict, or some out there might. You can disagree with the verdict. You can wish the case had unfolded differently. But it is a very different thing to claim that jurors ignored the evidence when the jurors themselves are telling the evidence, especially the DNA, is what weighed so heavily for them. So to discount their experience and their fair and just verdict is to call into question the legitimacy of our criminal legal system, which I am not willing to do. Juror A also pushed back on one of the ugliest rumors out there, which is the claim that some juror just got annoyed with the process, tired of sitting there, and just voted guilty to get it over with. And when I asked him about this, he said that is absolutely false. I thought that was the case. The jury only deliberated for 13 hours, which really isn't that long. I mean, we've seen juries go for weeks. So I just could not imagine the people that I was looking at in the courtroom in that jury seat every day were people that were just going to throw in the towel. So he did acknowledge, though, that there was a holdout, and he thought that that was important because that is what being thorough looks like. He said he did not see anyone being pressured into a verdict. Now, I don't know about all of you, but that does not sound like a broken process to me. That sounds like a jury doing the work. And I think really what we're seeing here is how people confuse disagreement with misconduct. It is very common for a jury to go into the chambers after all of the evidence has been presented and they've been given their charge, and to take an initial poll that is often divided, very divided at times. And the goal of deliberations are to go around the room, present one another's, interpretations of the evidence, and continue working toward a unanimous verdict if they can reach one beyond a reasonable doubt. That is what this jury did. That is what they did for 13 hours, and I think they are to be nothing but commended for it. And another thing that Juror A said stayed with me too. He told me that if there had been some real indication, get this, of a consensual relationship between Tara and Faust, he thought things could have, for some jurors, looked differently. He, again, only speaking for himself, not for anyone else. But he said there was none of that, of course. Instead, there was DNA and Faust denying that he knew her, period. And I've said this before in my own work on this case over the years, long before Edrick Faust was even arrested, that I actually believed this case would only be solved by one of two things: DNA, or someone walking into a bar, getting drunk, and confessing. So to hear a juror come back to me with the same point over and over again, DNA and denial, that landed with me, because that is beyond circumstantial, in my opinion. Now, before we get to Juror B, I do want to take a brief moment and bring in the words of my dear friend. She is still Tara's mother, Miss Virginia Baker. She sends the following quote to the jury, saying, "On behalf of myself and my entire family, thank you all for your service and for delivering a just, fair verdict in my daughter's senseless, violent, brutal murder. My prayers and thoughts are with each of you, for safety, for peace with your decision, and with the hopes that some part of our Tara's life and story touched you in some way. Thank you all from the bottom of our hearts." Again, that is from Miss Virginia and the Baker family. You know I always want to and will always include them where I can. Miss Virginia family, we love you. We continue to pray for you. And if everyone would drop a comment of support for the Baker family, I would really appreciate it. They do read them, and it's just a great way to show that there is a large support network out there that is on the right side of this. So, With that, let's talk about Juror B. Another gentleman, young. He gave me a lot of detail, and what I will say struck me the most was that I nearly learned nothing new from him that I learned from Juror A. Essentially, his account of what happened overlapped. Again, for him, the DNA was central. But before we even get to that, there's one detail from this juror that really matters, especially for people who keep trying to paint this jury as if they marched into the room thinking the exact same thing. And I touched on this earlier, but he got into the details of this. According to Juror B, when the jury first took its initial poll, the split was 10-1-1, meaning 10 guilty, 1 not guilty, and 1 person who wished to withhold their thoughts until later in the discussion. Because that, to me, does not sound like a jury rushing. That does not sound like a room where nobody was thinking independently. Instead, my friends, it's the exact opposite, right? That sounds like people coming in with different views, different levels of certainty, different backgrounds, by the way, and yet still had a willingness to keep working through the evidence before locking themselves in unanimously. And it is very common in a very complex case, like I said, for these feelings to be mixed. Starting from disagreement, I would argue, is the whole point of deliberations, right? But we could take that offline if someone has a different feeling. But this is really why I think it's important for people to understand that jury chambers are very organized. They are not dysfunctional. Deliberation does not equal dysfunction. This jury took their job seriously. That came through when I talked to every single one of them. I also want to say that I think that one juror being unsure at the beginning was really explanatory. I'm going to tell you why. And once again, when Juror B explained to me that things moved for him, he said it was the same thing that Juror A said, the DNA. Juror B told me that for him, the verdict came down to the DNA and to Faust's interview with the GBI, specifically denying knowing Tara Baker. In his words, he said that said everything he needed to know. And Juror B said that one not guilty vote simply misunderstood the DNA report, thought Melton's DNA had been found orally. That was not the case, and once it was clarified by the jury re-examining the DNA report, there was then a unanimous verdict and a discussion from there. So that put me at now 2 separate jurors telling me basically the same thing. I hope this isn't too much of a letdown. But again, not internet commentators, not Facebook speculators, and not people clipping each other's theories into little echo chambers. Jurors, period. Juror B also addressed the rumor that someone just caved in and voted guilty to go home. He said that that was not the case. In fact, he told me that the most important detail from any of these conversations was a turning point another juror had, the original one no vote, who had been confused by the DNA evidence, specifically whether or not Chris Melton's DNA had been excluded from Tara's mouth. Juror B said that once he re-explained that evidence to his colleague, once they re-examined the DNA report, there was not a let me go home moment, rather there was a light bulb moment for the juror that was the holdout. That's a huge difference because in this world, there is a big difference between someone surrendering under pressure and someone finally understanding something that had not yet clicked. Again, what do I keep saying? That is what deliberations are for. Not to force people, not to bully people, but to work through the evidence together. Now, before we go to our final juror statement, I do have a rumor fact check for you for the victim impact statements. Now, this is a new one for me. Miss Virginia's been hearing it all around. People online claiming that the victim impact statements read by the Baker family were written for them. What? No, that is categorically false. In fact, I personally watched that family wrestle with those statements. I watched them cry while making edits. I cried while reading. I watched them stop and start over, sit with the pain, and try to find the right words that no family should ever have to put into words at all. Those statements were not scripts. That was 25 years of grief. And that comes from a family speaking for a daughter who's been voiceless for just as long. So let's just quash that rumor now and get back to the purpose of this episode, because we do have one final juror to tell you about. All right, I want to close the juror portion of this episode with the full statement that I released from an individual, or received rather, from an individual that I'm going to call Juror C, a woman who served on the Tara Baker trial jury. I'm not going to interrupt this statement. I'm not going to over-explain it. I'm simply going to read it to you. What I can say is that everyone on the jury panel was thoughtful, educated, kind, and diligent. Throughout the trial, we carefully reviewed the evidence, presented, and took extensive notes. Each juror maintained multiple notebooks documenting testimony, timelines, and the key pieces of evidence. The level of care and attention each person gave to the process was remarkable. During deliberations, jurors treated one another with respect. No one was bullied, pressured, or influenced inappropriately. Every person had the opportunity to speak, ask questions, and thoughtfully consider the evidence. Ultimately, the DNA evidence was a critical factor in our decision. The scientific evidence presented during the trial carried significant weight in our deliberations and was carefully reviewed by all members of the jury. This experience weighed heavily on all of us. Serving on this jury was one of the most serious and emotionally difficult responsibilities for many of us. In the weeks since the trial, as some jurors have experienced harassment, we have continued to support one another. Several of us have remained in contact and formed bonds through this shared experience. Serving on this jury is something that will stay with each of us for the rest of our lives. End quote. And that is it. Juror C's statement in full. I think it speaks for itself. I think it lines up with what I heard from the two other men I spoke with. It pushes back on the online claims, and more than anything, it sounds like exactly what it is. The words of people who took this responsibility seriously and who are still likely carrying the weight of it. And to any juror from this case who may hear this episode, let me say clearly, if ever there comes a time you want to share your experience, your truth, or your perspective, there will always be a seat and a mic for you here at Classic City Crime. I also understand if you need more time or if you just want to go away. We are patient here, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. So this is what I learned, Classic City Crime family. Not everything, of course. They didn't share with me their every private thought. Of course, they could not share with me the internal monologues happening in the minds of other jurors, but I do think you really learned something very simple, that there is no bombshell, and that is how it has been from the very beginning. Just 15 when you're counting the alternates, ordinary Athenians who answered the call to serve their civic duty and did it well. The public story some people have been trying to tell about that jury room does not match what we have heard here tonight, because for a while now, two people have treated the truth like it's optional, like it can be molded into whatever version gets the most clicks, the most comments, the most outrage. But I did learn enough to tell you this. The public story people have been trying to tell about that jury room does not match what jurors themselves are saying. And I think that matters, y'all. Because for a while now, too many people have treated the truth like it is optional and like it can be molded into whatever version gets the most clicks or the most comments or the most outrage. That may work online, but that does not work here. You know the buck stops with me. At least, not if I can help it, right? But before we move on, let me one more time remind y'all again to subscribe on YouTube, follow on Facebook, and if you want to support this podcast, the PayPal link is always in the comments. Donations going to Sane from that as well. And I will end this by saying something that has truly been weighing on me. Jury service matters, my friends. It is one of the clearest ways that ordinary people, our peers, participate in justice, in accountability, and in public truth-telling. It is not glamorous. It is not easy. I can tell you because I was there. the photos, the videos, the testimony from 160 Fawn Drive that the jury and those in the courtroom had to see are images I will never forget. So I just want you to think about the weight of what they carried on top of the task set before them. They sat through disturbing evidence, like I just said. They gave weeks of their lives. They carried the burden of deciding one of the most consequential questions our system can ask. And now some of them are the ones looking over their shoulders. That is upside down to me. There is something deeply broken about a culture that is so quick to romanticize violent offenders, excuse violent offenders, or turn violent offenders into folk heroes, all while the people who fulfilled their civic duty, or members of the victim's family, or a podcaster who happened to come on the scene, become the targets for ridicule, harassment, and fear. My friends, that is not courage. That is not justice. That is not truth-seeking. And I'm going to continue to repeat that as long as I have to. You see, we do not have to agree with every verdict in the United States, but we should be able to understand that jurors should not be terrorized for serving. You do not have to love our system to understand that threatening ordinary citizens for their duty poisons that system even more. And you certainly do not have to know Tara Baker's family personally to understand how much courage it took for these jurors to sit in that room, hear what they heard, see what they saw, and still carry that responsibility through to the end. So if you're a juror in this case and you're watching, I want to say thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking your role seriously. The notes that I watched this jury take, the intent that they listened to each testimony with was remarkable. I want to thank you, too, for standing in the gap, even as people have punished you or tried to for simply being a part of the process. And the reality is, we're going to bring it right back to Tara as we close out here. Tara deserved nothing less. She deserved the truth. She deserved people willing to sit with hard facts. She deserved a process that took her life seriously, and praise God, justice has been realized. But now the work before all of us is guarding the truth. We have justice for Tara. Let us now make sure the truth for Tara prevails. I'm Cameron J. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, all the things to help us get the truth out there and to dispel the lies. But most importantly, take care, and I'll see you right back here very soon.